Welcome and thanks for joining this session on the use of innovative real-world emissions data for framing policy responses to our air quality crisis. I'm Sheila Watson, I'm Deputy Executive Director of FIA Foundation and I lead the Foundation's environment and air quality work. The FIA Foundation is a UK-based philanthropy with a global perspective supporting work around safe and sustainable mobility and research and advocacy in those fields also. We actually have a stand in the ITF exhibit at the moment, so please go and check us out and find out more about our work. So poor air quality is a major issue in pretty much every urban area across the world, and vehicles and their toxic emissions make a major contribution to that problem in many of those places too. This poor air quality is causing huge health problems, as we all know, for much of the world's population. And indeed, there are all too many millions even are estimated of premature deaths on an annual basis as a result of the illnesses which this dirty air gives all of us from babyhood, indeed through childhood into adulthood. So many cities are attempting to address this problem with policies which in many regards focus in on either excluding or indeed completely banning vehicles from city centres through low emission zones and so on. The basis, however, for understanding which vehicles to exclude and how to make those policies work is tested data which emerges through the regulations on vehicles. And sadly, as a case not so recent now, known as Dieselgate proved, all too often those emission levels in the real world are substantially higher than the tested values which many policymakers are using as the basis for their work. So that gap, which happened in the US, is evident elsewhere too. And the Real Urban Emissions Initiative, TRUE, the host of today's meeting, was set up in an attempt to address that gap and to ensure that good policy, good transparent data, was available to support good policy and consumer choice. So not only does TRUE use innovative technology to gather huge samples of vehicle emissions in the real world, but it also provides policy advice and support. Throughout today's short session, we'll be posting relevant reports and materials in the chat box, and we'd be delighted to hear any thoughts or questions you may have. It might not be possible to put them to the panel today. As I say, our session is short, but we will endeavour to answer them in the chat or later if you leave your details. So this session is an opportunity to hear more from our lead partner in the Real Urban Emissions Initiative, and that's the International Council on Clean Transportation, ICCT. And they've led the work which TRUE has undertaken in Europe and in the US. But we'll also hear from our two special guests on what use this data is proving for them in the work that they're doing in policy and philanthropy. So I'll introduce our guests a little later, but first we'll hear from Johan Bernard, who is a senior researcher in the ICCT's European team. His work focuses on real-world emissions, the central work of TRUE, and he'll take us through what TRUE has done in Europe recently. So over to you, Johan, and if I can gently remind you to stick to your time, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila, for the kind introduction, and I'm very glad to be presenting some of the TRUE work that we've been doing in the past and the one that we are also ongoing. So let me try to share my slides first, if you can confirm that you see those. Right, perfect. So as Sheila said, we're going to be talking about real-world emissions in Europe in this first presentation, and Tim will be expanding a bit that work to other areas of the world. But first of all, why does this matter? Why are we looking into real-world emissions of vehicles? So I think that the key here that already Sheila mentioned is that transportation emissions have a significant health burden, and particularly in cities. That work, which is coming from some of our colleagues, looked into the PM2.5, particularly META 2.5 and northern deaths attributed from transport and related to nitrogen oxide excess of emissions. And so what you can see here is on the y-axis is the number of deaths related to the population. And of course, as we can expect, many people die in the world from transportation-related emissions in China. But if you look at the size of those bubbles, which are basically transport attributable death per 100,000 population, a city like London, like Milan, like Stuttgart, like Turin, actually shows that per amount of inhabitant per person, this is also very significant and an issue in Europe. So that's why this matters, and that's why we should aim at reducing urban emissions to improve air quality in Europe, because it does impact our health. As was mentioned also, I think part of the problem that was discovered in September 2015 was Dieselgate. And that also come from some of our colleagues at the ICCT who did some testing back in 2013 and 14 on some cars. And whether they initially thought that those cars were really clean, and especially in US when the complaints and enforcement system was thought to be much better than in Europe, what they found out is that when those vehicles were tested on the road in real world testing, the emissions were 30 times higher than what they expected. So that what really triggered this investigation from the US EPA and California Air Resource Boards, and eventually led to the Dieselgate. But what was true for that particular manufacturer in the US turned out to be true for most of the manufacturers in Europe. So when we looked in the first time at remote sensing data across different cities in Europe, we find out that actually none of the diesel vehicles at the time met the laboratory limit while tested on the road. So I think that's also the reason why True and the Real Urban Emission Initiative was created, to try to shed light on that issue and try to leverage real world emissions data to garner public support and increase the public awareness of that issue, and try to inform consumers to have them make a better decision when purchasing a new car. I think remote sensing also turned out to be a very useful tool to look at the potential impact of different policies options, such as, for example, low emission zone. I will show a couple of examples on that. And maybe the last point is also that part of that work, remote sensing data can also be helpful to support a transition to zero tailpipe emissions vehicles. So just a few words about how remote sensing is working, because this is the tool that we've been, or the using that we've been using in the True initiative. And what you see here is basically two techniques, but both are using the same principle of using light or laser beam to basically scan the exhaust plume of those vehicles, half a second of measurement. But what's very important is that this measurement is contactless, so the vehicle doesn't know that it's being tested. And coming back to the Dieselgate, it is a crucial point that those vehicles are unaware of the fact. So through the light beam, the technique look at the absorption of different wavelength and get the researchers access to the exhaust gas composition. So we'll be looking at nitrogen oxides, dioxide, hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, ammonia, and particulate matter, all related to carbon dioxide. But what's really interesting about remote sensing data is that you can really cover a wide fleet, because once you will gather 100,000 of measurements, you can start digging into those measurements and look at the difference between, let's say, diesel versus petrol, and different, for example, Euro standards. Are they, performing as the type approval predicted or expected? And you can even look at the difference between manufacturers if you have enough data. One of the pilots of the True study in 2017 was in London. I would say that one of the key takeaway of that study is that it was really important to take measurement locally and not source it from different cities in Europe, because In particular, those black taxi that are mostly in London were found to be really high emitter, even compared to the average diesel car. So that taxi that had a derogation for emitting 50% more NOx compared to the average passenger car, because it is also considered as a special purpose vehicle, in fact, emitted about 10 times more than what the type approval limit was. And those also results were confirmed with laboratory testing, independent laboratory testing, showing also that same extreme level of emissions. I think as maybe example of the consequence of those results, Mayocan pushed for a new regulation that aimed at phasing out older taxi 3 years sooner than initially expected, to actually help improving the situation related to the taxi. But Mayocan did not wait for its study to be published. In fact, since already 2018, only zero emissions capable vehicle can now be newly registered as taxi in London. So that problem was already being partially taken care of. What's also interesting is the second study that occurred in Paris a year later. And that testing was done in June and July during some of the days were during a heat wave. And so we had the chance to measure at very warm temperature, above 30 degrees Celsius and even 35 degrees Celsius. And what turned out to be quite interesting is that, yes, we knew that NOx from diesel vehicles were high, but it turned out that those emissions were even higher during those warm conditions. And that's actually triggered, I would say, another series of issues related to the kind of cocktail that NOx emissions can do with ground level ozone, for instance. So it is quite important because those kind of trends are not really visible with the usual toolkit that cities use for their emissions modeling work, such as handbook emissions factors. So it's quite important to have those insights that you can only get if you test in the city at a particular time of the year, because again, you will be able to understand why your initial prediction differ from the reality. We've also used the remote sensing data in Paris as a way to assess the impact of the Paris low emission zone already in place. As you may know, Mayor Hidalgo plans to ban diesel in 2024. And what we could say from our analysis is that by looking at the impact of the different low emission zone implementation steps, but specifically that diesel ban, we confirm should have a significant impact on reducing average NOx emissions from the fleet in Paris. So again, the confirmation that this policy is expected to work. And to give you kind of a rule of thumb of what are we talking about, we think that this will accelerate the NOx reduction by something between 7 or 10 years compared to the natural fleet turnover. So significant impact benefits for the citizen in Paris. We also looked into a kind of a bolder scenario where Paris would actually do the diesel ban, but sooner, meaning in 2022 instead of 2024, and quantified how much better or quicker those reductions could be. And finally, on the right part, we looked into the NOx reduction if those vehicles that are being banned would be shifted to zero emissions activity. So either a zero emission vehicle, or simply switching to mode of transportation that are emitting zero emissions. And that, of course, had increased even more the NOx reduction anticipated. So I think this is also calling for alternative to internal combustion engines equipped cars. And of course, the quicker the shift to zero emission vehicles, the more important will be the expected benefits. We also looked at, for the first time, data in Eastern Europe with Calco data in Poland. And what's interesting is that fleets in Eastern Europe are typically older than what we have in Western Europe. And what we looked at here is the estimated share of NOx per fuel type and the Euro standard. And what you can see is that pre-Euro 6 diesel and pre-Euro 4 petrol are the predominant sources of passenger car NOx emissions. So Krakow doesn't have a low emission zone in place right now, but if they were to have one, those are the ones for which they should look into, trying to restrict their access sooner than later. We also looked in Krakow at the NOx emissions, the comparison between taxi and the average passenger car. What you can see is that in average, a taxi in Krakow would emit more and significantly more NOx emissions compared to the average passenger car. Why is that? First of all, because petrol taxi tend to emit more than the other passenger car. And this is somehow, I would say, known or expected because those taxi tend to drive much more per year compared to the average passenger car. And we know that emissions deterioration is a thing. So the older will be the car, the higher the chances of that car to emit more, because the control system, the emissions control system that is being using is going to be less and less efficient. And the second reason is that a lot of those taxis disproportionately were Euro 5 diesels, which we know now are one of the worst performing vehicles in terms of NOx emissions. We've also done testing thanks to FIA Foundation in Clean Air Fund in Warsaw last fall. We measured during 4 weeks from end of September to October. And we measured over 250,000 records with gas reading. I think there was really also another important point to look into a large campaign, or to do a large campaign in another large city of Poland, to study the performance of the latest Euro 6 vehicles, the latest introduced development of the Euro 6 regulation. But also to quantify the average fleet emissions impact of vehicles movement from Western to Eastern Europe, because it is known that many vehicles are being imported from Western to Eastern Europe that might deteriorate the overall fleet average emission. And finally, to look into informing, we'll talk about Brussels in the next slide, but also perhaps informing the low emission zone in Warsaw that is yet to come. So to give them tools to try to build a low emission zone from scratch. Where should they start, basically? So looking at Brussels 2020 remote sensing campaign, there was also a 6 weeks testing and measuring over 250,000 records. Maybe the peculiar thing about that testing is that for the first time, we are also collocating the measurement with noise measurement, with the collaboration of the Labo Bruit noise laboratory from Brussels, that will use this information to basically match the noise measurement with the remote sensing and the vehicle's information. And also we had to do a specific testing for buses, where you can see that some of those buses had the exhaust on the top of on the roof of the vehicle. So we had to come up with a kind of a system to measure those vehicles to widen the scope of the fleet of buses that we were measuring. Now I'll just finish because the presentation is almost over, but with for the first time also testing remote sensing and collocated with what's so-called the particulate number measurement. So this time it's an intrusive testing, but looking specifically at the topic of DPF, diesel particulate filter fraud. And I think the main takeaway of that is that only 4% of those vehicles represent about 85% of the total particulate number emitted. So I think Ruiz will be talking about this a bit, but I think there is a huge possibility here, an opportunity to impact the air quality by getting rid of those dirtiest vehicles for which the diesel particulate filter is not working. And I'll just stop here, quickly saying that we've been measuring and publishing real-world emissions data. That's turned out to be quite impactful, and we believe that remote sensing is a well-suited a tool to obtain fleet real-world emissions data, and it can be applied in many ways to have a evidence-based policy evaluation and development. I'll stop here because I think I'm a little bit over, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Johan, for that incredibly interesting presentation. And I know there's so much lies behind it, and it would be great to talk more about that. And if we have time, we will come back and try and do that. But I would like to just move us on now to our panel discussion. And we have two people with us today who've both got a great deal of interest and expertise in the issues that we're considering. So first, if I can introduce Louise Dupre, who works as Sustainable Mobility Project Manager for Brussels Environment, the organisation in Brussels that worries about these issues. And I know that one of the main jobs on your desk at the moment, Louise, is to look at the low emission zone options that Brussels could take up. And as we've just heard, TRUE's testing in Brussels. So I think it'd be good to hear from you a little more about how you plan to use that data. And then secondly, I'd like to introduce Matt Whitney, who's Portfolio Manager for the Clean Air Fund, CAF, and who leads their strategy program around air quality data. Clean Air Fund, for those who don't know, is a philanthropic initiative with a mission to bring together and tackle air pollution, but to bring together philanthropies, researchers, experts in the field, and find those scalable solutions. So first, if I can ask you, perhaps going to you first, Louise, what most stands out to you from the work that was just presented by Johan on what TRUE has been doing in Europe? So Louise, can I ask you to take that first?
Yes, can you hear me well?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, okay, well, thanks for the invitation, first of all. We're very happy to be discussing these findings. Perhaps what Johan showed at the end, and also the fact that I've been witnessing this by measuring with a PN counter the number of particles coming out of diesel cars myself, because I participated in this project. The fact that you only have a handful of vehicles which make the large majority of number of particles emitted on the whole bunch of vehicle tested, and this 4% tested diesel vehicles that exceed 1 million solid particles per cubic centimeter. That was really impressive to see that, and we've been using that in many ways. We are monitoring every year our policies, namely the low emission zone, which you've mentioned, but also we need to convince people about the new milestone. And next January 2022, people will have to stop driving with a diesel Euro 4. And this is the last generation of vehicles which are not fitted with a DPF if they're diesel. And this campaign has really helped us realize even more. We knew about the fact that starting Euro 5B, you need to have a DPF, but the fact that we measured it and we have some images behind that really helps us make the case and convince people. It's very difficult to sometimes communicate environmental legislation such as the low emission zone. And we're really planning now with the communication team to be really using that project to communicate that. So it's not initially, we didn't plan that in the work program with the ICCT and the whole TRUE initiative, but it's another great outcome of this very precious work that ICCT is doing.
Thank you so much, Louise, for that. And Matt, what would be your first thoughts on what you're hearing from Johan today?
Yeah, I think I'd take two main takeaways from the talk. I think firstly, it's how significant the problem is. So yes, Euro 6D standards seem to be a significant improvement on the prior standards, but particularly in Poland and the example from Warsaw, that's a tiny share of the fleet. So, air pollution from road transport is going to be a significant issue for the foreseeable future in these places, unless we find ways to make the case and to accelerate the transition away from the polluting vehicles and towards the more sustainable ways of getting around our city. And secondly, I think just how valuable the data set from TRUE is to supporting that transition. So, I mean, from our work, we've seen that it's pretty rare that a single measurement campaign can be so informative to show the scale of the problem, who's contributing to it, and what the impact of different solutions are. So I love the example from Paris that showed that implementing the phase 5 of the Paris low emission zone can bring forward the NOx reductions by, I think, 7 to 10 years against the baseline low emission zone or no emission zone scenario. And for me, I think that's just incredibly useful information. And for people, obviously, like Louise, have got to make decisions about implementing or advising on low emission zones, to see the impact that different policies will have and the real world consequences it will have on air quality is just gold dust. And I hope that more cities see the potential of that kind of work and understand the value of collecting real world emissions data.
Yes, thanks, Matt. And I think one of the points that Johan made very clearly, which is a similar discovery from what is incredibly rich data, is that even well-intentioned and positive policy can be tweaked and improved. So, for example, in London, the black cabs, and the fact that very soon after that, the Mayor of London actually adapted his approach and brought forward some incentives because he could see just how needed they were within that subsector, I think is a really extraordinary kind of, justification for doing the work to get such immediate policy impact. And so going back to you, Louise, I know you're in the throes of working these things through, and there's no doubt Brussels is a city much plagued by heavy traffic. Any of us who've travelled know those issues, and that you have a very keen civil society sector watching these issues and following what you're trying to do. So I wonder, is it possible to tell us a little more about how flexible your policy parameters are and the specific way in which you think through and the data on individual vehicles and subsections of Brussels traffic is going to help you in framing your plans, and maybe a little about your timescales and so on too would be interesting to those listening who are in your shoes.
Yes, sure. So we, as I said, the list of goals within this project has been becoming bigger and bigger. We saw a lot of opportunities. Johan mentioned the fact that, for instance, we are measuring noise from vehicles and making an analysis of that. That was also not planned. The same about this PN meter and the DPF fraud detection and enforcement control. This was also not planned, and it's extremely useful. So it's going to be a bit difficult to name all the what we're doing, but I would perhaps name a few very concrete examples where the True initiative already had an impact on decision making a bit more than a month ago. So this relates to what Johan presented about this PN meter testing, counter testing we've been doing. And partly as a result of that, I wouldn't say that True initiative in our project is the only reason behind that. We knew that there was an issue with DPF fraud. There had been a study made by a very well-known Flemish organization called GOCA, which was also involved at European level in the periodic inspection centers at European level, showing that there was a problem with people removing the DPF on the diesel cars, and that this could cause a significant amount of a particulate matter that would harm people's health. We knew there was such a problem, but the project really helped to put the finger on it, to measure it, and also to bring together periodic technical inspection centers, which collaborated with us, with ICCT and the True project, to actually measure particles. Also, some local authorities which are not dealing with environment like we are, but which are dealing with these kind of road issues and which do not have air quality on their agenda. So that really helped, and thanks to that, we managed to make the case for it, and we had the ministers agreeing on a new legislation to control, starting in 2022, July 2022 to be more precise, to detect DPF removal or DPF deterioration by vehicles. So Belgium is now, with the Netherlands, the first European member states to actually control that. So it's really good news for anyone living in Belgium, but also for the rest of Europe, because we believe that other countries are going to follow suit. We found out that Germany now is also moving on that. So you can't say this is just thanks to this project, but I witnessed that clearly the project contributed greatly to that and helped us really move on quite quickly on this. So that's a very clear example. And more broadly, of course, you mentioned it, Sheila, or Johan, we're now drafting the post-2025 low emission zone criteria. And we also have a plan to phase out diesel, like was mentioned for Paris, and to phase out petrol vehicles. And now this is being discussed by ministers at the moment for the Brussels region. So this is just for the Brussels region. The other piece of legislation was for the whole of Belgium, which has been adopted on DPF fraud. So here, that would be the low emission zone for Brussels, that would become more stringent. And we expect to have a first reading by ministers at the end of the month or beginning June. So that's very important. And we've been using some of the findings by the True initiatives to feed that. In particular, when it comes to motorcycles, what has been done in Paris by this campaign, we've been using some of those results to help. This knowledge has been helping basically what we should do with those type of vehicles which currently are not under the scope of the low emission zone, and we're thinking of integrating it because we're being more comprehensive, addressing all vehicles. And we've been looking at this study from Paris because there's very little evidence about the emissions from these vehicles. So it's one example where the True initiative work has been useful. But I haven't mentioned noise, I haven't mentioned our emission inventories, which we're going to be looking at thanks to the remote sensing results and other things. But these were two examples.
Thanks, Louise. I mean, it's extraordinary to hear that any intervention or support of this nature can have quite such a wide-ranging impact. And I think it's interesting to see how open Brussels is to the evidence in framing the policy and the success you're having. And I wonder a little whether, you know, that is in part because people can see this as truly independent data. And so, Matt, you know, turning to you, Clean Air Fund have very helpfully supported this work elsewhere in Europe. And I kind of would be interested to know what your thinking on why you wanted to do that was. You've touched a little on what you see as the benefits, but perhaps also your reflections on this idea of trust and transparency and openness in the light of a situation in which previous data sources came to be a source of suspicion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, on the why, firstly, what I find interesting about working on the issue of air quality is actually the solutions are actually quite simple at the kind of highest level. We just need to stop burning stuff and take, you know, whether that's in our vehicles or in our power plants or in our stoves. If we stop burning stuff, we have better air quality. But when that boils down to policy decisions that we have to make, that becomes quite difficult, and there has to be trade-offs and informed actions that we take that don't have adverse consequences. And so at the Clean Air Fund, you know, we approach the issue broadly, and we look at, in the places that we work, along three main themes of work: on data, demand, and delivery. So on data, it's about providing the actionable information that fills the evidence gaps that's preventing from these actions and policies from being implemented. On the demand side, we need to raise the awareness with diverse groups of stakeholders and citizens about the issue of air quality and what they can do about it. And then on the delivery front, we need to support the decision makers and businesses and policymakers to take the actions that they can do to improve air quality. And I think that the True initiative, the reason we funded the work we did is because it actually touches on all of those. And so it informs the sort of breadth of the work that we're doing. And to take the example of the project that we're doing in Warsaw, we're supporting ICCT to do in Warsaw. The city there is considering the different options and different policy interventions it can take to reduce emissions from its transport sector. And we need to ensure that that happens in the most equitable, most effective way. And what better way of doing it than showing what the real world emissions are from its current fleet and the implications of different policy scenarios in reducing those emissions. So, you know, it's a no-brainer really to undertake this work in the places that we're operating. I think on the kind of accountability point, I mean, the genesis of the True initiative, which Johan touched on around Dieselgate, just shows that we have to have accountability for companies and manufacturers around the world, and continually review and improve on standards. And so this kind of work just shows that we can't just introduce a new standard and sort of think job's done, move on to the next thing, because it takes a long time to implement those. And it also shows that sometimes those standards aren't adhered to, and it needs this independent work to show that. And I think I'd also just say that, you know, with this interesting example of a study happening in Brussels and in Warsaw in Poland at the same time, we can start to build a picture of the impact of exporting vehicles from one place to another. And you know, air quality is a very local issue, but actually it's happening everywhere. And we can't just have a kind of singular focus and say, yeah, we'll tackle it in this one place, if that means that the vehicle fleet is updated in that place, but sold off to another place. And we export the air quality problems elsewhere. So for me, it's about bringing transparency around the issue in as many places as we can, and providing the data that shows that we need to just get over this kind of car-led society that we live in and transition to a more sustainable and healthier approach to transport that benefits everybody, rather than kind of exporting the problem around.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for making that point. It was one I was going to make myself about the secondhand vehicle flows. There is a tendency to think that if we solve our problems in our own territories, then that's the problem solved. That's so very not true, particularly when it comes to climate and issues here link quality and climate. And I think it is the case that we hope that the data that emerges from these markets, not least because Brussels has a very new car fleet. We know the data shows that that Poland has an old car fleet, that we will start to be able to see those flows, as you say. And Louise, I was very impressed to hear you say that some of the work that you're now leading, building with true data and obviously from your own other sources, is creating interest and potentially change across Europe. And Johan, I wondered whether maybe you could just give us a couple of words on some of those cross-European ideas. I know where True is engaging in different schemes and initiatives to improve the technology, which is innovative behind this form of work, but also to share some of the learning. That might be something which I think it will be interesting to hear about for anyone who is sitting elsewhere on the European continent at the moment.
Yeah, we are indeed involved in different remote sensing related projects, as you mentioned. I could mention, for example, that we are involved in a project where with the environmental ministry of Germany, which is also looking into the way or ideas to use remote sensing as a way to update their emissions factors. I think that maybe is of interest for this, because we have found out indeed that the information that remote sensing provide, this local information in a couple of weeks, can be very helpful in understanding some of the current gaps that those cities in Germany are using. Maybe another project is the CARES project, which is the EU-funded project that investigate different technologies of remote sensing. And one which is quite interesting is also called clone chasing. So it's a car following another car or a truck, and that is I think really important because it is related often to the problem of heavy-duty tampering. Because as you may know, those heavy-duty Euro 6 vehicles, they tend to be thinner than previous emission standards. However, when the owner of the truck tamper with this vehicle to save on basically save on fuel and save on the so-called diesel exhaust fluid, which is a way to reduce NOx emissions, these vehicles can emit up to 15 times more. So suddenly that vehicle becomes even dirtier than a well-functioning Euro 5 vehicle. So this is really important to tackle this issue, and we are involved in a couple of projects where we are investigating the use of remote sensing also as a way to catch those vehicles. Because if you just rely on a random search, you're gonna miss 80% of those. But if you do use remote sensing to catch those, you're gonna have a good hit in 90% of the cases. So this is another way of how to target the vehicles in a more effective way.
Thanks, Johan. That's great. That's good to know that True is not only delivering right here and now, but also looking forwards and seeing how this technology can improve. And as I said before, how the whole of Europe can gain from it. So I certainly could talk about this sort of data for hours and hours, but we have such a limited time that I have to move on now from this discussion, and indeed from Europe. I can't do that without saying thank you to both Louise and Matt and to Johan for the contributions you've made. But now I want to turn to the rest of TRUE's work, because as I said at the beginning, the TRUE initiative is a global initiative. And Tim Dolman has joined us also from ICCT, where he is the compliance and enforcement program lead. And he's going to tell us a little bit about the work that TRUE has been doing outside of Europe and is planning to do actually beyond that. Tim, again, a gentle reminder that our time is tight, but over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. And I just want to confirm that my slides are coming through here. Great, thank you. So yeah, thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. As Sheila mentioned, I've been tasked with talking a little bit about the work that the TRUE initiative is doing in areas outside of Europe, and really the efforts we've put forth to try to really grow the initiative and be active in the main global regions for the initiative. So I just wanted to start off by showing a map indicating some of the cities that the initiative has engaged with over the last 4 years, kind of broken down to the cities shown in yellow, showing cities where TRUE has done city-specific work. So for example, the work in Europe that was talked about earlier in London and Paris, as well as more recent work in Brussels, Warsaw, and Sofia. And then cities shown in blue indicate other cities that the initiative engaged with, primarily through some of the workshops that we have organized. So there you can see really the opportunities we've had to talk with cities from around the globe. So today I'm going to be focusing in on some of the work that we're doing in the United States, Latin America, as well as Asia, focusing on the cities of New York City, Mexico City, Jakarta, and Seoul. So the first project I want to talk about is the work that the initiative has been doing in the United States. This is a very interesting project for us because it's a way to take advantage of existing remote sensing data to really provide some important insights into the real world emissions from the United States vehicle fleet. In our European work, we spent a lot of efforts on collecting new data. However, in the US, there's actually a number of states that use remote sensing as part of their inspection and maintenance programs. So for example, the states of Colorado and the state of Virginia both have programs that are collecting millions of remote sensing records each year. This data is primarily used to, as I said, support their inspection and maintenance programs. But we saw an opportunity for using that data, compiling it, and analyzing it to provide a lot more information about real world emissions than was being produced by the use of the data in the inspection and maintenance programs. So last year we compiled data from both states and developed a database that also included additional information and data from the University of Denver, which is one of the first groups to use remote sensing technology and have conducted testing throughout the United States. So the initiative was able to access and compile this data to develop a database of United States remote sensing emissions data. And this slide is just showing the different data sources as well as the number of records that are represented in the database. I just want to call everyone's attention to kind of the sheer size. So the total database is close to 60 million records, which is massive and just a massive collection of real world emissions data. It represents data collected between 2010 and 2018. So it has a nice temporal coverage, allowing us to look at how emissions are changing over time. And as I said, it represents data from multiple states, hundreds of different sampling sites. So it has very good geographic coverage. And it's also been collected in a broad range of driving and ambient weather conditions. So like I said, we think this is a really nice representative data set for the fleet in the United States and allows us to really do some nice deep analysis of real world emissions that we wouldn't be able to do with smaller data sets that don't have the same level of coverage. So in the next few slides, I just wanted to highlight some of the findings from our analysis of the database, just showcasing some of the things that can be done with such a large collection of remote sensing data. So this first chart on the right of the slide shows long-term emission trends for light-duty vehicles and light-duty trucks in the United States for 3 different pollutants: carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, and nitrogen monoxides. So for each pollutant, each vehicle type, the plot shows the average fleet emissions by vehicle model year, going back to 1990 model years and continuing on through 2018 model year vehicles. And I think this plot shows a really good example of how remote sensing data collected in this way can provide insight into the effectiveness at a fleet average level of emission standards. So the vertical bands show the implementation of more stringent standards in the United States for light-duty vehicles. And you can see over the last 30 years kind of how effective those standards have been at the fleet average level in reducing emissions from light-duty vehicles. Similarly, we were also able to investigate long-term trends from heavy-duty vehicles, here showing a similar plot for NOx emissions from heavy-duty vehicles. Here we're also comparing against emission standards in place in the United States for heavy-duty engines. A few things to point out are kind of, again, we see over time the effectiveness of the standards in reducing fleet average NOx emissions from heavy-duty vehicles in the United States. However, we can also see that for most of the years considered here, most of the model years, NOx emissions in the real world exceeded where emission standards are set. So kind of, again, indicating kind of the issues of higher than perhaps expected real world emissions. And especially for post-2010 model year trucks, which employ the newest, most efficient control systems, we can see that it took about 6 years before emissions came down to the level where the standards were set. So kind of indication of how it takes some time when new emission control technologies are introduced to refine those systems and really deliver the real world emissions reductions that are expected from the implementation of more stringent standards. Another key aspect of this database is that it allows us to look at how emissions from individual vehicle groups change over time. So this plot shows how emissions of nitrogen monoxide for light-duty vehicles and light-duty trucks change as vehicles age. So we can see for each vehicle model year represented here, in all cases, emissions increase as vehicles age. And that's, as Johan mentioned earlier, due to just the natural deterioration and reduced efficiency of emissions control equipment. We can see that, like I said, it's kind of common across all vehicle model years. Emission deterioration rates have improved in more recent years. However, our findings were that the real world deterioration rates still can be oftentimes higher than manufacturer reported values. So just another kind of piece of evidence to showcase the importance of measuring emissions in the real world, especially given the changes in emissions over time that we've seen through emissions deterioration. Another key aspect of the data set that we want to look into is to try to address a somewhat simple question. We want to look at what percentage of the fleet contribute the most to total emissions. So in this case, we're looking at the contributions from the oldest vehicles in the fleet and trying to estimate the percentage of vehicles that contribute 50% of total emissions. So these plots show the distributions of NO emissions by vehicle age, measured in Colorado and Virginia. Each plot shows a different calendar year when measurements were made. So that the key point I want to highlight here is that the oldest vehicles in the fleet contribute disproportionately to total emissions. So in 2010, we estimated that about 14% of the fleet, so the 14% of the oldest vehicles in the fleet, contributed about half of total nitrogen monoxide emissions. And that contribution is increasing over time. So if we compare 2018 to 2010, we can see that in 2018, only 11% of the fleet was contributing 50% of total emissions. So I think the implications of that finding are pretty clear, kind of trying to find ways to target and remove those vehicles from the fleet will result in the most emissions reductions from policy actions. So think about things like low emission zones, which haven't been yet adopted in the United States to the same level that they have in Europe. Perhaps could be ways to implement policies that would help to address this massive disproportionate contribution from the oldest vehicles in the fleet. So some of the current work that the TRUE Initiative is doing now is trying to build on the United States Remote Sensing Database to do some targeted work with New York City. Here we're trying to pair true real-world emissions data with traffic information from New York City, especially in respect to diesel trucks. Previous studies have shown that diesel trucks and buses account for about half of the traffic-related adverse health impacts from transport in New York City, and that low-income communities located next to where there's high levels of diesel truck and bus activities are disproportionately exposed to that pollution and bear the brunt of the health impacts from those emissions. So we're now working with the city to use real-world data to address where those emissions are happening spatially and to provide some insight into some actions that might be taken by the city in order to address high emissions from diesel trucks. Moving on from the United States, the initiative is also active in a number of Asian cities. Here, I'm highlighting some of the work that we're doing in Seoul. Seoul and South Korea in general, like the United States, employs remote sensing to support their in-use vehicle emissions control program. They've shared about 1 year of remote sensing data with the TRUE Initiative, which represents about 500,000 vehicle emissions records. So our team is now analyzing these data to try to provide some insights for Seoul in their implementation of their green transport zone policy, which is their low emission zone, and looking into how different vehicle categories are contributing to total emissions, building on the work that we've done in several European cities now. We're also fairly excited about a recent remote sensing emissions study that was conducted in Jakarta. It was a 4-month study, the first application of remote sensing in Indonesia that we're aware of. Really, we think kind of a impactful study in terms of producing real world emissions data in an area, in a region where there's not a lot of information available about real world emissions, and a lot of where a lot of the air quality modeling relies on inputs from emission factor models that were developed for other regions and representative of other regions' vehicle fleets. So we think that there's a lot of opportunities to really inform a lot of the kind of newly implemented or policies being discussed, such as implementation of new emission standards, vehicle inspection programs, various types of access restriction policies that are under discussion now. All can be informed by the real world data set that the initiative has collected in Jakarta. And just to provide some more specifics of that study, in this case, we partnered with the Bandung Institute of Technology, who the technical team that led out the emissions study. The study also included 1 month of targeted testing of diesel trucks and buses. Here in the picture on the right, you can see the team set up at a Trans-Jakarta BRT dedicated roadway to collect data on the bus fleet in Jakarta. And also collected at more than 10 locations, working in coordination with the Indonesian Toll Road Authority, BPJT, who were an active partner in the testing program. So like I said, it should produce a very insightful and important real world emissions data set. And finally, I just will end with highlighting some work that we're also doing in Latin America. So we've been working with the Mexico City Secretary of Environment to analyze remote sensing data that was previously collected in the city in 2016 and 2019. Some of our initial analysis highlighted here has really shown the importance of one, kind of the importance of taxis to emissions of hydrocarbons. So the plot on the right shows kind of the order of magnitude difference in emissions from private light duty vehicles versus taxis when it comes to hydrocarbon emissions. Another key finding of this preliminary analysis was that we're seeing higher than expected emissions deterioration for both private vehicles and taxis in Mexico City. Again, kind of we're factors of 4 to 5 increase in emissions from these vehicle fleets over 2 to 3 years of aging. So much higher than what we see in other regions. And some of the initial evidence indicates this might be tied to higher than expected evaporative emissions from vehicles in Mexico City. So something we plan to look into further as the initiative grows our work in the region with a planned remote sensing emissions testing study planned for later in 2021. So hopefully that gives an indication of some of the work that the initiative is doing in other regions and where we hope to grow and continue to engage as we continue to grow the initiative. So with that, I'll thank everyone for the opportunity to talk about some of our work today.
Thanks so much, Tim. And there is so much we could go on to talk about, but time is not our friend in such a short session as this. I know that India is on the plans, and that Africa is in the plans too. True is a regionally based initiative now, and so those are very exciting opportunities. But I'm afraid I have to close our session really simply by thanking all of you, all of our presenters and speakers today, Johan, Louise, Tim and Matt, for your excellent contributions, for finding the time, in fact, to come along and share what I think is phenomenal work. It's not often that you can do a piece of work, or in our case, support a piece of work, which is going to give you so much dense information from, you know, age of vehicles and the impact, temperature of the outside area, type of vehicle. We should have made it clear perhaps that True looks across the range. It's not just cars. And now in New York, to hear that there's the potential to dig into some of those other important issues around society and community and where this pollution is happening really is extraordinarily exciting. It sometimes makes me smile that we talk somewhat glibly of the idea of a vehicle emitting 15 or 20 times what it should be doing. Maybe we're just horribly used to this idea, but I think that alone would be an extraordinary contribution to simply know that the on-road values are so very different to the tested ones. And it's great to hear from Louise that this information is really useful in the public policy sphere, and from Matt that in terms of building advocacy in countries where awareness or acceptance of these things is not strong, and that this data and this sort of work contributes positively, then that really does, of course, make this work worthwhile. Not that it's over, and certainly anyone listening in now who'd like to know more about the work of the initiative, check out the website, www.trueinitiative.org. As I said earlier, check out the FIA Foundation stand within this ITF conference, because there's more information there about True as well. Or as indeed I said before, pop your query, question, thought into the chat box, ideally with some contact details, because we haven't, I'm afraid, had a chance to touch on audience questions today, but we do truly want to be able to answer them, and we will try and do that. So yes, finally, I simply say thanks again to everyone who is here today listening in, and take great care of yourselves, and thank you.